The end of the American involvement in the Vietnam War came on the night of April the 29th, when the last helicopters took off from the roof of the American embassy, carrying Ambassador Graham Martin and other senior officers away from what was the most ignominious, most disgraceful event in American foreign policy history. More than 50,000 American lives sacrificed, hundreds of thousands of lives of South Vietnamese allies, and now we were fleeing from the advancing North Vietnamese army. The shame, but also the crushing defeat impacted so many, many people. At night, there was a vigil in front of the White House. I had been working at my office all day long, and I looked out the window and I could see people gathered in Lafayette Park holding candles. Something drew me out the door and go over to the park and join in. I came upon a Vietnamese diplomat, a woman named Phung Zoom, who I had known very well, was a friend. I admired her greatly. She was holding a candle. And the park was filled with Vietnamese, but also with Americans, all sharing in this terrible moment, this vigil to commemorate and to share the loss that we all felt. A few days later, by chance, there was a state dinner hosted by President Ford for Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. My wife, Lei Sun, and I were invited to the social part of the dinner, the dessert, the dancing in the White House lobby. Normally this would be such an incredible moment. There we would be dancing in the White House. Should normally be filled with joy, but of course we're still overcome with the sadness. Her family, who had gotten out of South Vietnam and that last week, had arrived in Washington, D.C., minus, of course, her brother, who was the Army Ranger who had been killed. But as we were there in the White House vestibule, the military band playing music, dancing, and President and Mrs. Ford were nearby. We walked over to them and for a moment just asked if we could speak. And my wife, speaking, I think, on behalf of every Vietnamese refugee who had made it out of the country thanks to the incredible efforts of so very many Americans, 130,000 Vietnamese refugees were free. And my wife said to President Ford that I just want to thank you on behalf of all Vietnamese for rescuing them, for rescuing my family, for rescuing so many others. It was an incredibly poignant moment. A few weeks later, I brought my 2-year-old niece named Thuy, the daughter of my wife's older brother, to the White House. Here she was one of the first refugees to arrive, and I brought her over to David Kennerly's office, the White House photographer. He called Mrs. Ford, and she and President Ford actually came down to the White House lawn. They brought their golden retriever, Liberty, and I brought Thuy out to join them. And Mrs. Ford, sitting on the grass, the White House in the background, was holding Thuy, who had a big smile on her face. And that photo that David Kennerly took appeared on the front page of Parade magazine. Sunday supplement read in probably millions of homes on Sunday. It was an incredibly powerful message of Mrs. Ford and the President having embraced all these refugees, having not left them behind, but having done everything in his power to save as many of them as he could. And subsequently, decisions would be taken that would lead to 1 million Vietnamese coming to the United States and resettling in our country. But that moment in the White House, that photo on the front page of Parade magazine, were a powerful message reflecting what I think is President Gerald Ford's legacy moment, saving the refugees from Indochina. And I was so proud to have been a part of that. And for that humanitarian effort, I received a medal pinned on me by National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft in his office in the West Wing of the White House with my wife and holding our 6-month-old son in her arms as General Scowcroft, who I admire so very, very greatly, pinned his Meritorious Service Medal on my suit as a culmination, as a recognition of all that I had done as a still relatively junior officer in one of the most pivotal moments of American foreign policy of the second half of the 20th century, and in having more than 100,000 individuals from Saigon, from South Vietnam, now living in freedom in America.